Kia ora, I'm Eleanor. Thanks for joining me for this series on using DNA test results to Whakawhanaungatanga, make connections. I'm honoured to have the opportunity to share what my whānau and I have learned since DNA testing a few years ago. Most of this series will be in English, but there will be some kupu Māori words. You'll find a glossary in the handout. Please keep in mind that the information on the DNA testing companies' websites is updated frequently and may have changed by the time you're watching these videos. All information presented here was up to date as at December 2020. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge my tupuna wahine, my great-great-great-grandmother Zelda, who was born in Kororareka, Bay of Islands, and my pepeha, which was gifted to our whānau by a ngāpuhi kaumātua. Zelda's father was Māori, but we're not sure if she ever knew him or his whānau. If she did, no information about them was passed on to us, her descendants. The loss of whakapapa, genealogy, family history, whānau connections are some of the many reasons that Māori are turning to DNA testing, our whānau included. I'd also like to let you know what this series is and is not about. While DNA testing carries some risk for everyone, it can be especially problematic for Indigenous peoples. I won't be addressing these important issues today, but if you'd like to know more about some of the concerns that DNA testing may raise for Māori, you'll find a link to an article on that topic in the handout. In this series, I'm going to focus on DNA test results, and in particular, some steps for using them to connect with your whānau Māori and or your Pākehā family. In part 1, we'll look at some of the issues Māori DNA testers may face when using DNA to Whakawhanaungatanga. And in parts 2 and 3, we'll look at how we can use this info to start working with our results at 2 of the main DNA testing companies. First up for this talk, we'll take a quick look at DNA and how inheritance works. I'm just going to stick to the basics because I know there'll be lots of great talks on these topics at ROOTSTECH. If you're brand new to using DNA for genealogy, often referred to as genetic genealogy, I hope you'll get time to watch some of these other videos. Just keep in mind that it can be a bit more complicated for Māori. Next up, we'll see how DNA testing companies like Ancestry, FTDNA, MyHeritage and 23andMe build your match list, and why using this information to Whakawhanaungatanga can be extra challenging for Māori, particularly in terms of our Māori and Polynesian matches, and particularly for those with one or more Māori great-great-grandparents. So what is DNA? Well, for today, we can just think of DNA as a set of instructions for building and operating you. Most of this DNA gets passed down from your parents to you in handy packages called chromosomes. Chromosomes come in pairs, a bit like earrings. Usually we get 23 pairs of chromosomes. Half of each pair comes from our mum, and the other half comes from our dad. There are actually 4 types of DNA. I'm mostly going to be talking about autosomal DNA today. Autosomal DNA is tested by companies like Ancestry, FTDNA, MyHeritage and 23andMe. It's found on chromosomes 1 to 22. So everything here except X and Y, the 23rd pair of chromosomes. Autosomal DNA is pretty special. When we test this type of DNA, we can learn about both our father's and our mother's ancestral lines. Autosomal DNA test results are particularly helpful for making connections with whanaunga who share at least one common ancestor in the past 4 to 6 generations. That's from your parents to your grandparents, right back to your great, 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 great grandparents. The reason we can make these connections is because autosomal DNA gets passed down in a fairly predictable way. There's a bit of maths involved here, but first, let's take another quick look at the chromosomes. We've seen how autosomal DNA comes in chromosomes and how your mum and dad give you half of each chromosome pair. Another way of saying this is you get 50% of your autosomal DNA from each of your parents. I'll be calling it DNA from now on just to keep things simple. Now, one important thing to understand is that your mum and dad didn't create the DNA they gave you. They inherited it from their parents the same way you did. So the DNA that your mum or dad passes on to you is actually just half of the DNA that he or she inherited. and that means you got about 25% of your DNA from each of your grandparents, or around 12.5% from each great-grandparent, or about 6% from each great-great-grandparent, and so on, all the way back to your 64 great-great-great-great-grandparents, that almost invisible row of tupuna at the top of this chart. From those ancestors, you'll still have inherited at least a tiny bit of DNA, around 1.5%, from most, if not all of them. So if we look at our whakapapa, we can see that the amount of DNA you inherit from each ancestor halves, on average, every time we step back a row or generation. This is how you inherit your DNA, and it's the same for everyone else. So how do DNA testing companies use this info? Well, we can also think of the DNA that you inherit from your ancestors as DNA that you share with them. If you and your dad both took DNA tests, for example, the DNA testing company would see that the two of you share 50% of your DNA. In other words, 50% of your DNA and your dad's DNA is exactly the same. In your test results, your dad would show as a match. DNA testing companies know that in general, testers are most interested in knowing about their close matches. So they put the matches who share the biggest amounts of DNA with you, people like your dad, at the top of your match list. You'll often hear testers call these people their top matches. If your mum also DNA tested, you'd see her at the top of your match list too, and you'd see you share the other half of your DNA with her. And if your sister or brother tested too, they'd find that they also share 50% of their DNA with each of your parents. Another thing you'd discover, unless you and your sibling are identical twins, is that each of you have a different mix of your parents' DNA. You both share 50% with your mum and 50% with your dad, but it's not exactly the same 50%. On average, full siblings share about 50% of their DNA with each other. DNA testing companies have different ways of showing how much DNA you share with a sibling. So when you look at your results, it might show that you share a little bit less. The reason for this gets a bit technical. So for today, we'll just say that if you and your sibling have the same mum and dad, you'll share about 50% of your DNA with your sibling. The rest of your DNA you'll share with your parents. You can only pass on the DNA that you inherit. You and your siblings will each pass on half of your own unique mix of your parents' DNA to your children. As we saw in the earlier slides, mokopuna and grandparents will share about 25% of their DNA with each other. And these moko, who are first cousins to each other, will share about 12.5% of their DNA. So we can see that the amounts of DNA that you share with your whānau depend on your relationship to them. The only percentage that is guaranteed, if you have 23 pairs of chromosomes, is the 50% of DNA that you will share with each of your parents. All the other numbers I've shown here are averages. You might share a bit more or a bit less than 25% of your DNA with your koro, for example. Here's the amazing thing. Even if these two moko didn't know each other and didn't know their whakapapa, if they took DNA tests, the testing company could predict that they might be first cousins because they share 12.5% of their DNA. This is the whole basis of using DNA testing to Whakawhanaungatanga. However, the testing company's relationship predictions are just that. They're educated guesses. They're based on a lot of data, so they're pretty accurate, but they aren't the end of the story. You might have spotted that you share about 12.5% of your DNA with your great-grandparent, and the same amount of DNA with your first cousin. If you get a match who shares about 12.5% of their DNA with you, you'll receive a list of estimated relationships that will probably include great-grandparent, first cousin, and also some other suggestions, such as great-uncle or great-aunt, half-uncle or half-aunt. The list is called estimated relationships because from the DNA alone, there's no way to know which relationship is correct. We always need more information to figure this out. I know I'm starting to use a lot of very specific terms for relationships. The Family Search website has a couple of really great charts that show you what all these terms mean. There's a link to these charts in the handout. Now this is where it gets complicated. Estimating relationships based on the amount of DNA that testers share works just fine for some people. However, all around the world, there are many peoples or communities it doesn't work well for. These peoples have different histories, but they tend to have a few things in common. They had a small founding population, which means there weren't many people in the community, at least in the beginning. They were isolated in some way, up until fairly recently, or at least for quite a long time. Maybe because they lived in a remote place, or because there were strict rules about who they could marry in that society, or maybe both. And most importantly though, the community stayed isolated for a really long time. Some examples of communities like this are the colonists of the American Midwest, Acadians, Ashkenazi Jews, Cajuns, First Nation peoples of the Americas, Quebecois, and of course no prizes for guessing, people from the Pacific, including this little country here, Aotearoa, New Zealand. While there are different accounts of early migration to Aotearoa, New Zealand, many of them suggest that a small group of about 500 people sailed here from eastern Polynesia about 700 to 800 years ago, and after the initial settlement period, had no visitors for the next 400 to 500 years. After a few generations, there wouldn't have been many people around the Motsu that weren't already related to each other. All of this means that over time we have ended up descending from at least some of our tupuna Māori in multiple ways and sharing multiple common ancestors, lots of shared tupuna, with other Māori. Some of the fancy words used to describe all of this are founder effect, bottleneck, and endogamy. So instead of having a family tree that looks like this, which is a simplified version of the trees we've looked at up till this point, with each line going back to 64 different ancestors, you might get a tree that looks something a bit more like this, where some of the lines go back to the same ancestors. This very simple example only shows a little bit of endogamy on the family tree. In reality, our whakapapa can be much more tightly interwoven, and the further back in time we go and the more Māori ancestors we have, the more interwoven our whakapapa will be. If we go back far enough in time, all people around the world will have interwoven family trees like this, but not all DNA testers can easily see the impact of founder effect and/or endogamy in their DNA match lists. Even though this whakapapa is pretty simple, with only a few lines back to the same ancestors, you can see there's still quite a bit going on for the descendants. Now you might not have a whakapapa like this. You might have 64 different great-great-great-great-grandparents, and so might many of your matches. But beyond those tupuna, sooner or later you will both have lines that go back in several ways to multiple shared tupuna Māori. There's not enough time in this talk to explain everything that happens as a result of founder effect, bottlenecks, and endogamy, but two key things that make it extra challenging to use DNA test results to Whakawhanaungatanga are: 1. You will often share more DNA with your Māori matches than what the DNA testing companies expect. This means your predicted relationship with a Māori match will often be much closer than it should be. And if you have more than one Māori great-great-grandparent, you may have hundreds or even thousands of Māori matches who are predicted to be closely related to you. These matches might not even be Māori. They might be from another island in the Pacific. Instead of a DNA match list like this, where the tester has 392 close matches, a typical result for a Pākehā DNA tester, you might get a match list something more like this, if you have one Māori great-grandparent, or like this, if you have two Māori great-grandparents, or like this, if you have 4 Māori great-grandparents, or even like this, if you have 8 Māori great-grandparents. The second thing you'll probably find is that some of the DNA testing companies' features, which are meant to help us sort out exactly how we're related to our matches, may not work the way they're meant to, or they might not work at all. This is because the DNA you're sharing with your matches is coming from those multiple common ancestors, rather than just the single ancestral couple that the DNA testing companies expect. If anyone's ever suggested that you should try auto-clustering your matches, for example, they'll be imagining that you get a result something like this, where each coloured cluster is a group of your matches who match almost everyone else in the cluster and who probably all share at least one common ancestor. If you have one or more great-great-grandparents who are Māori, you'll get an auto-cluster that looks something like this, where each coloured cluster still represents a group of your matches who match almost everyone in the cluster, and they all probably share at least one common ancestor. But that doesn't really help us narrow things down in terms of how we're related to these matches. Okay, but why does this matter? If you're content to just look at your ethnicity estimate and your hundreds or thousands of cousin matches, that's all good, there's no problem. However, if you want to know exactly how you're related to your DNA matches, if you or your parent was adopted, for example, and you have one or more Māori great-great-grandparents, then the relationship predictions that the DNA testing companies give you with your Māori or Polynesian matches and the standard advice and tools may not get you very far unless you have a DNA match to a family member such as a parent, full sibling, half sibling, aunt or uncle, or grandparent. But I only said it's complicated, right? I didn't say it's impossible. There are things we can do. The first step is to figure out which of your many matches actually shares recent common ancestors with you. So how do we do this? Well, there are some things that are known about DNA inheritance. Let's go back to our whakapapa. On this side of the line are 7 ancestral couples, our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. We already know that we share large amounts of DNA with all of these common ancestors. Another thing to know is that we share mostly long segments of DNA with them too. We also share large amounts of DNA, including long segments of DNA, with the recent descendants of these ancestral couples. That is, with their other children and grandchildren, and with most of these ancestors' great-grandchildren as well. If we only share one great-grandparent with a descendant, we might share only a small amount of DNA and it might just be in small segments. If you're looking for one of these recent common ancestors or a recent descendant of one of them, look for matches who share both a lot of DNA and big segments of DNA with you. If you and an unknown match share lots of DNA and lots of big segments of DNA with each other, you most likely descend from at least one of these recent common ancestors, either a parent, grandparent, or great-grandparent. Now, what about the people on the other side of the line and their descendants? Well, this is where it gets tricky. Matches whose most recent common ancestors with you are tupuna Māori at this generation of your whakapapa, or even Polynesian ancestors from further back in time, may still share a large amount of DNA with you, sometimes even enough to trick the DNA companies into predicting that you're very closely related. However, if the ancestors are very far back in time, this DNA usually won't be in big segments. It will only be in small pieces. And this is the clue that we can use to separate out matches who actually share recent common ancestors, those below the line, from matches who only share more distantly related ancestors. That's the ancestors above this line and further back. So the key takeaway is this: find the matches who share multiple long segments of DNA with you. If you use Facebook but you've not already joined any specialist DNA help groups, you might want to join some. You may also want to join some of the projects at FTDNA. You'll find links to these in the handout. You'll also find links to more information about the impact of founder effect, bottlenecks, and endogamy on DNA test results. In the remaining 2 parts of this series, I'm going to step through how to find the matches who share long segments of DNA with you at FTDNA and at Ancestry. Regardless of where you've DNA tested, I encourage you to watch parts 2 and 3. Both of these include general information that may be helpful regardless of where you have DNA tested. If you tested at Ancestry, MyHeritage or 23andMe from November 2013 onwards, you can upload a copy of your raw data file for free to Family Tree DNA. I hope you found this talk helpful. Thanks for joining me. Thanks also to everyone who has contributed both directly and indirectly to this presentation, and a special thanks to ROOTSTECH for putting on this amazing event.